Hello everybody, and welcome to the latest instalment of Women in History, which is called Victorian Female Reformers. The problems that Mary Wollstonecraft had come up against in trying to carve out an independent role for women in society in the 18th century continued far into the 19th. Indeed, arguably, they grew worse, because the effect of industrialisation and economic growth was to produce a far greater number of middle-class and upper-class women who were often highly educated and ambitious, and yet were frustrated that they had no recognised role to play outside the home. Society was still organised around the doctrine of what was called separate spheres. Men did all the important things, like running the country, even though after 1837 they had to defer to a female monarch. Men also dominated the economic life of the country, although with more help from women than is often realised. The female role was to stay at home, organise the household, look after the children, and provide the emotional support that the menfolk needed. To seek a role outside the home was still regarded as something slightly shocking. And to seek paid work was, as one writer put it, to cease to be a lady. Nonetheless, economic circumstances forced many women to follow that road. The most acceptable work was some form of teaching. There were 21,000 governesses in Britain in 1850, and their lot was as difficult as it had been for Mary Wollstonecraft decades before. It's no wonder that governesses like Jane Eyre became the heroines of literature. They were unhappily placed, too lowly to be part of the family, but far too superior to be considered a servant. The problems that governesses could find themselves in, not least the sexual ones, led to the foundation of a governess's benevolent institution in 1841. Colleges were founded to train them, like Bedford College, one of the first institutions of higher education for women and now part of the University of London. The other possibility was school teaching. The teaching of infants was considered an appropriate extension of the traditional female role, and there were plenty of opportunities, with new elementary schools springing up across the country. But the pay was low, and normally for unmarried women only. If you married, you left your job and concentrated on your husband and your children. Women teachers struggled to be taken seriously, but they were pioneers, the first women who could be regarded as part of a profession, even though at the bottom end of it. Another traditional female role which was turned into a profession was, of course, nursing, which we'll come back to later. But this again involved low pay, long hours, the foregoing of marriage, and involvement in menial tasks. There was no question of women enjoying the pay and prestige of the higher ranks of the medical profession. The struggle for the recognition of women doctors was a long one. Until the 1840s, the only way a woman could be a doctor was by pretending to be a man, which, as we saw in the case of Mary Wollstonecraft's pupil and Mary Shelley's friend Margaret King, did actually happen. In 1846, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman in England to gain a medical qualification and practice openly as a doctor. But she had to undertake a long struggle for recognition, and then only by specialising in gynecological complaints, which many male doctors were too embarrassed to touch. By the end of the century, there were still less than 200 lady doctors, as they were always called, and other professions took even longer to open up, often not until well into the 20th century. It's sobering to remember that Cambridge University didn't grant degrees to women until 1946, and the necessity to give up your job when marrying was widespread into the 1950s. There was one way in which these restrictions on women's activities could be circumvented, and that was by charitable work. That, of course, had always been recognised by the churches as an acceptable female activity, and as well as the traditional Lady Bountiful role of looking after the welfare of your tenants, employees and poorer neighbours, a practice which spread from the aristocracy into the middle classes in the 19th century. It was accepted that middle and upper class women might play a public role in a modest way, outside the orbit of their family, in charity work and philanthropy, provided they weren't paid for it. But modest was the key word. Any wider activity by women on a local, let alone a national stage, was regarded as deeply suspicious in conservative circles. It smacked of radicalism and the example of the French Revolution. Yet even conservatives couldn't object when women organised themselves for patriotic purposes, as they did during the Napoleonic Wars, when women banded together to make flags and banners, present colours to regiments, make recruiting speeches, and collect subscriptions for patriotic funds. This kind of activity didn't stop after the war had finished. There were a host of social and economic problems caused by the Industrial Revolution, and women seemed ideally placed to tackle them. Because they had no political role and were used to crossing class boundaries in their traditional work of charity visiting, women could go into places, meet people, and generally get their hands dirty in a way that class-bound men couldn't. Radical religious groups like the Quakers and the Unitarians, which had always allowed women a greater role and valued female education highly, were the leaders in this, with more conservative churches and chapels following on behind. By the 1840s, some of these women were becoming famous. The Unitarian Mary Carpenter, for instance, with her work with poor children, striving to keep them out of prison. She was the one who coined the term juvenile delinquency. Not many women could follow this path because, of course, it meant leaning on men, husbands or fathers, to provide the financial backing, unless they were lucky enough, like the famous Angela Burdett Coutts, to be heiresses and fabulously wealthy in their own right. Coutts, among many, many things, founded a home with her friend Charles Dickens for the ex-prostitutes, was an early supporter of the RSPCA, co-founded what later became the NSPCC, and was a pioneer of decent housing for the poor in the East End. No one else could touch that, but it was now recognised that women could enjoy an ambitious and fulfilling career, if an unpaid one, in helping to tackle the more and more intractable problems that the rapid industrialisation and urbanisation of Britain threw up. Although the problems were all too visible, governments in the laissez-faire era refused to do anything about these unless strongly pushed. And yet, since only the state had the resources to solve them, much of the work of philanthropists, including female ones, consisted of pressurising and badgering MPs into taking action, using all the techniques of publicity and propaganda. Philanthropy began to overlap with politics. This wasn't entirely new. Burdett Coutts always refused to take a political stance, but others had never been so delicate. The first political reform movement in which women played an important role was, of course, the anti-slavery movement, in which women organised a nationwide boycott of slave-produced sugar. All subsequent radical movements had a substantial female element. The Chartists weren't exactly a middle-class movement, but the Anti-Corn Law League was impeccably middle-class, and it was for the cause of free trade that many respectable women first considered taking a political stand. This was, of course, decades before the Pankhursts. The idea that women only showed an interest in politics or engaged in political activity in the campaign for the vote is quite wrong. Women had an influential political role long before that, and not just in a behind-the-scenes way, but out in the open on the public stage. Some of these reformers became very famous indeed, and we're now going to look at the lives and achievements of some of them. The first and oldest of them was Elizabeth Fry. She was born in 1780 in Norwich, the fourth of 12 children of a prominent Quaker family, the Gurneys. Her father, John Gurney, was a wealthy banker, and her mother, Catherine, came from another banking family, later to become very famous indeed, the Barclays. Elizabeth was brought up at the family's country home just outside the city, Earlham Hall, which is now part of the University of East Anglia. She and her siblings received a good education, girls as well as boys, although Elizabeth always had problems with spelling. When she was 12, her mother died, and things changed. She found herself taking on a quasi-maternal role herself, responsible for the upbringing of her younger siblings, one of whom, Joseph Gurney, was himself to become a distinguished philanthropist. Elizabeth was brought up in comfort, in an atmosphere where social concern and charitable work were taken for granted, but was otherwise quite worldly. According to her diary, it had been Elizabeth's mother who was the pious one, and Elizabeth inherited her outlook, more interested in the things of the spirit, in the life hereafter, than the rest of the family. And then she met Amelia Alderson. Amelia, who was considerably older than Elizabeth, was vivacious and attractive in a way that Elizabeth was not. She came from a family who were not Quakers, and political in a way that the Gurneys were not. They played a prominent part in the anti-slavery movement and in the campaign for parliamentary reform. The Quakers, being dissenters, were of course excluded from any share of political power, however rich they were. Amelia introduced the young Elizabeth to a wider world, to the liberal ideas circulating in the 1790s, and to the writings of Tom Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft, whose friend she was. But in 1798, Elizabeth turned back to her Quaker heritage. She went to hear a sermon by the American Quaker William Savery, who was visiting Norwich. Savery was an abolitionist and a friend of the Native Americans. He preached what would now be called the social gospel. It was the duty of the Christian to fight poverty and injustice fearlessly, to help those whom no one else would. Savery was to have a powerful influence on Elizabeth. She seemed to have experienced some kind of religious conversion, readopting Quaker dress and speech. She pledged to dedicate her life fearlessly to good causes and seek out injustice wherever she found it. But first there was the little matter of marriage. She was introduced to Joseph Fry, a member of a wealthy Bristol Quaker family, not yet famous for making chocolate. In 1800, aged 20, she and Joseph were married. They moved to London, living first in the city and then moving out to a country house in what is now the heart of the East End, Plashet House in East Ham. Over the next 20 years, Elizabeth was to produce 11 children, 5 sons and 6 daughters. Remarkably for that era, all but one survived into adulthood, and most of them were to outlive her. One might have thought that bringing up such a family would have been a full-time job, but Elizabeth was still looking for a cause to which she could dedicate herself. She started visiting her poorer neighbours and bringing them food and clothing in the traditional way, but she needed more, and in 1813 she found it. A friend took her on a visit to Newgate Jail. She was appalled by what she found. Prisoners awaiting trial and those who'd been convicted and were waiting to be transported or hanged at Tyburn were crammed in together, sleeping on filthy straw. The prisoners did their own cooking and washing in the tiny cells. She was particularly shocked by the women's section, where many women had their children living alongside them. The following day she returned with gifts of food and clothes. She had found her cause. For the next 3 years, difficulties in her husband's business made it impossible for her to do anything. But as soon as she returned. She started a school for the children and considered what could be done to alleviate conditions generally. In a remarkably far-sighted move, she asked the prisoners themselves what they thought, and on the basis of their suggestions, devised a system of rules which he asked them to vote on. And the authorities went along with her ideas, at least for women prisoners who were to be supervised in future by their own matrons. Elizabeth realised she couldn't reform things by herself, so she founded an association for the reformation of the female prisoners in Newgate and persuaded other ladies to join. Eventually this spread nationwide and became the first national women's organisation. The essential thing, she thought, was to teach the women to sew, patchwork sewing having a calming influence. Then they'd go on to knitting, which would give them a skill which they could use to earn money when they got out of jail. Rehabilitation, not just punishment, must be the aim of a prison sentence. Soon these ideas were spreading to other jails, even the prison hulks in which convicts awaited transportation to Botany Bay. Elizabeth took a particular interest in these. She persuaded the authorities to provide closed carriages to take the women to the ships, instead of sending them through the streets of London in open carts, in chains to be pelted with refuse by the population. She visited the hulks themselves and talked to the captains of the ships that would take the convicts to Australia, trying to make sure that they had enough supplies of food and water. She eventually persuaded the authorities to provide a care package for women convicts to pass their time on their journey, including material and sewing tools to make quilts, string, knives and forks, and most important of all to her, Bibles. She wasn't, of course, the only campaigner for prison reform. The state of the prisons had been a national scandal ever since John Howard had first drawn attention to it in the middle of the 18th century. But for a woman to get involved in such a sordid subject was unprecedented. Women prisoners were usually regarded as even more incorrigible than the men. The factors holding back change were first that jails were run locally without national supervision, and second that apart from debtors' prisons, which were a special category, no one spent a long time in prison. If acquitted, you were released. If found guilty, you were either hanged or, if you were lucky, transported. There was no great incentive for anything to change. But with the growth of humanitarian sentiment, there was a new attitude. The criminal law, with its 200 capital offences, now seemed archaic. It seemed appalling that even a child could be hanged for stealing a loaf of bread. Juries began to refuse to convict, and transportation, which had once seemed a relatively humane alternative to the death penalty, no longer seemed so attractive. The demand now was for prison itself to become a punishment for crime, with a system designed to encourage repentance and moral reformation of the inmates. Elizabeth Fry was strongly in favour of this. The first of these modern-type prisons, the Millbank Penitentiary on the site of what is now the Tate Gallery, was opened in 1816. But these new prisons, of course, cost money. Elizabeth and her brother, Joseph, took part in the lobbying of MPs, but to little effect until Robert Peel became Home Secretary in 1822. Peel had accepted the arguments of the reformers and began work at once, cutting the number of capital crimes in half and beginning the work of reforming the prisons themselves. The Prisons Act of 1823 laid down basic minimum standards for the core of prisoners, for the care of prisoners. Separation of men and women was to be compulsory, the women to be supervised by female warders. The use of leg irons and manacles was prohibited. Prisoners would get regular visits by a chaplain to help them repent. More importantly, warders were to be properly paid. Previously, jailers had been remunerated by fees paid by the prisoners themselves, an obvious invitation to ill treatment and corruption. But Peel fought shy of the government taking over control of the prisons directly. They remained locally run. And although an inspection system was established, the inspectors were the local JPs, so it wasn't very effective. Still, it was a start on a very long road. Elizabeth continued with her work with transported prisoners into old age. Altogether, it's been calculated that she visited 106 prison hulks and saw 12,000 convicts. She began to visit prisons all over Britain, in Ireland, Scotland and the north of England, often staying the night in them. And everywhere she invited members of the nobility to come and stay with her and see what conditions the prisoners had to endure. It's not clear how many of them took up the offer. She continued to lobby MPs, helped by her brother-in-law, Thomas Fowell Buxton, who'd been elected to Parliament himself. She became the first woman ever to be invited to give evidence before a parliamentary committee investigating prison conditions. But her humanitarian work was never confined to prisons. In the winter of 1819-20, she came across the body of a young boy lying dead in a London street. This led her to establish the first night shelter for the homeless. Using her Quaker contacts, she also established what were called visiting societies, composed of volunteers who went into the homes of the poor to help and comfort them. This was carry on the traditional female role, but adapting it to a new urban environment. And there were eventually a chain of them across the country. And while she was doing all this, she was campaigning for the cause she never forgot, for the abolition of slavery, a cause which succeeded as far as the British Empire was concerned in 1834. In 1828, her husband had gone bankrupt, and he was disowned by his fellow Quakers. The family had to move to a smaller house, and the continuation of her work was threatened, but her brother stepped in to provide the necessary financial backing, and so her work continued. But by the 1830s, her attitudes were beginning to seem amateurish and old-fashioned. The fashionable idea now was that prisoners could best be reformed by keeping them permanently in solitary confinement. To Elizabeth, with her belief in kindness and humanity, this was anathema. But, undeterred, she carried on and indeed expanded into continental Europe. She visited French prisons and was introduced to the King of Prussia, who was so impressed by her work that on a visit to England in 1842, he insisted on meeting her in Newgate Jail itself. By now, her fame was so great that she came to the attention of Queen Victoria herself. Victoria gave her an audience even before she ascended the throne, and when she became queen, met her several more times and contributed money to the cause. In 1845, Elizabeth Fry died of a stroke at Ramsgate, where the family had moved. She was 65. Her husband, who'd reinvented himself as a tea merchant, outlived her for 16 years. Unlike many eminent women of the early 19th century, she's never been forgotten, and her ideas were to come back into fashion. It was decided to set up, in her memory, a house of refuge for young women coming out of police custody or prison, and this was established in Hackney and still exists, though now at Reading. There are a host of other memorials to her in different parts of the country, and some abroad. As might be expected, there are several in Norwich and in London, including her resting place in the Friends' burial ground at Barking, and at the head of a list of famous Green Cemetery. She's been commemorated in a set of stamps, and of course, from 2001 to 2016, she was shown on the Bank of England £5 note, with a scene from a famous painting of her reading to the prisoners in Newgate. There's only one 19th century female reformer who can be said to equal her reputation, and that's the one we'll go on to next time, which is Florence Nightingale. Thank you very much. Hmm.